What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? One of my friends had someone following her home, hiding in the bushes so they couldn't be seen. She booked it to her house, got inside, and he was watching the house from the outside. She called the cops. They come along quietly and got the jump on him. He had condoms, handcuffs, and a knife. When they got his DNA, it turned out that he was linked to a half-dozen rapes in the area. She credits her regimen of running sprints to outrunning him that night, and firmly believes she would have been raped if she couldn't outrun him then. Rule #1. Cardio. Rule #2. Double tap. Rule #3. Beware of bathrooms. Rule #4. Seatbelts. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch/ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. What really upsets me most about this is that Singleton was released from jail for good behavior and went on to murder a different woman a few years later. Roxanne Hayes. I think in these scenarios we can safely say that if you can rape someone, chop their fucking arms off, and leave them to die, you aren't ever safe to be released. Well, he hasn't chopped any arms off or raped anyone in the last 2 years while in jail, so he is pretty much good to be released early. What the fuck were they actually thinking? Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out. He has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally we are supposed to stay inside the glass shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help while calling the police/EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom and was wanted for rape and murder in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again. Kudos to the slugger that hit him. Plot twist. It was the 6-year-old. Damn girl deserves medal. In my town in the early 90s there was a notorious killer that had all of BC, Canada on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work, arborist. She was in her laundry room when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was friends with her husband and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently he told him he could just walk in, which she knew was bullshit. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left she called the police, but he was long gone by the time they got here. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught. His mugshot put on TV, and it was the guy in her house. Holy shit, this is horrifying. What a smart woman. Seriously, that's creepy AF. If she hadn't said he would be home any minute she would be dead. Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body's still in the cave. Didn't they almost get him out? But then one of the pullers snapped and he got trapped even worse. That's my personal nightmare. Yes, this story is why I'm never going spelunking. One of many stories. In general I wouldn't say I'm claustrophobic, but Fuhuahuahuac caves happened to me. Have posted about it before. I was around 11 years old, and I woke up in the middle of the night to a man straddled on top of me with his hand over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream bloody murder. I say tried, cause when you are truly terrified it can take a second to find your voice. My mom heard me screaming and came in and fought with the guy. He was at least 6 feet, she was 5 feet 3, and scared him enough with the fighting and screaming that he took off out the window he had come in through. Never did catch him. Hold the fuck up for a moment. What the fuck? Yup. Still impacts me 30 years later. How in the fuck are you okay? Been a long time since it happened, but I'm not 100% okay. I'm still really paranoid about in-home security. People mock me sometimes about it, but not a lot I can do about the fear. It is around to stay. My brother's ex-GF had 2 older sisters. They died before she was born. One day they decided to play hide and seek or something. So anyway, they both climbed inside a chest and accidentally locked themselves in. They suffocated. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up. Maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. This sounds exactly like the story of There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane, another real-life event where a woman drove a van full of children down the wrong way while being high on some drug before eventually hitting another car and killing herself and the kids. Really odd the similarities between Judy Kirby and Diane Schuler's cases. Years ago my now husband worked for an industrial laundry company in their head office when a PR disaster happened that also mentally screwed up a number of people. Their company collected laundry from large hospitals and medical type businesses, egg care homes etc and cleaned them. You can imagine the sort of heavy duty cleaning, bleaching, boiling etc needed to remove those sort of biological contaminants. One day a laundry cart went through the usual bleaching, boiling cycle before it dropped out into a conveyor belt to be sorted for drying/pressing when there was a horrid scream. A small newborn baby's body had been discovered tangled up amongst the sheets. It had been cooked. The laundry workers were distraught. The whole place had to be shut down. Police called in. The laundry tracked back to the hospital to discover what happened. It turns out thankfully in some ways, stillborn baby had been left in the cot waiting to be taken down to the hospital mortuary after the parents had said their goodbyes and covered it with a blanket, but somehow one of the nurses hadn't realized, just on shift, was the best guess, so just grabbed up all the linen out the cot and off the bed in the delivery room with the body bundled inside and emptied it into the laundry hamper/trolley thing. The other nurses/parents assumed the baby had been collected by the mortuary to be stored awaiting their funeral decisions. The laundry was found not to be to blame, but the parents were devastated and the hospital took a lot of flack. The poor laundry workers who discovered the body ended up being given counseling before eventually quitting. The laundry did amend its practice to individually emptying each laundry hamper into the industrial machines instead of just tipping them in to stop anything like that happening again. I had to dig through my hospital's biohazard trash because a nurse had thrown out a fetus. Probably the worst day of work I've ever had. Did you find it? Yes, I found it. After about 3 hours. Wasn't a fully formed baby yet, but it was pretty disturbing to find. All the other stuff I had to sift through was just the icing on the cake. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. 2 of them died on impact and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the '60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after to be a warning to all. Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs I looked, and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door, and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months I didn't tell my family, because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost, and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800-900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. Home invasion is seriously one of the scariest things that can happen to a person. The home is like a final refuge from the world, and to have it violated like that is so unnerving. My wife called me while I was at Walmart one day. She had a broken ankle and had just had surgery on a hernia. Her mobility was like 5 out of 100. And of course someone tried to break in. Her saving grace was yelling through the door that she was on the phone with cops. Really with me, him on the way home. And I passed the guy to the exact description my wife gave me and the cops. I swerved his ass off his bike, hopped out the car, and sat my fat ass on top of him until the cops got to where I was. Guy had a gun, robe, lock tools. It cold been bad. Luckily though he ran, and with even more luck we crossed paths. He cold went anywhere when he left my yard, but he came straight towards the Walmart I was leaving. That was about 3 minutes away. He was armed, and you simply went over to him and sat on him. I'm picturing the Blob from the X-Men movies. A guy I worked with was riding his dirt bike through the woods and somebody hung a cable between 2 trees. My buddy caught his throat on it and saw the dude steal his dirt bike. Woke up in the hospital with a lacerated throat and a broken larynx. Pretty crazy what somebody will do for something so cheap. Dude is lucky he didn't get decapitated. I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, New York. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light, and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched as he veered over the double yellow, and smashed head on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside, and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911, and say there has been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and we ran to the cars. Now, I used to think this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. My god, it was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten motherfucker driving the other car was some rich drunk cocksucker. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I'll have to go back home a day or so later. I'm trying to find a link for the news story, but I can't, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on Lohan Channel 12 News. This is probably the thing that freaks me out the most, the entire randomness of it, and yet it is fairly common. I work as a firefighter, and have seen plenty of drunk driver-caused deaths. Rarely, I have a quick mini freak in my head while I'm driving, but then I convince myself it probably won't happen to me. During WWII, an American airplane crashed near the Japanese island of Chichijima. There were 9 servicemen on board. One was rescued by an American submarine. The other 8 were taken in by the Japanese. Don't want to go into all the details, but through some time and events, the Japanese ended up eating those servicemen. But that's not the weird part. The one serviceman who was rescued, that was George H. W. Bush. Google Chichijima incident for more details if you'd like. No thank you. This thread has already given me enough nightmare fuel. Have you heard of the Nazi so bad that other Nazis, in particular fellow SS Nazis, constantly tried to get him and his unit disbanded and arrested? No? Well, his name was Oscar de Loanger, and his unit was nicknamed the Black Hunters or the de Loanger Brigade. Oscar de Loanger was an early adopter of the Nazi Party. He had been thrown in jail before for being a pedophile. Eventually, when World War II broke out and healthy ideal Germans were dying in droves on the Eastern Front, Oscar's old pal Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, granted him a command of a unit made up originally of German poachers, and eventually German criminals being held in civilian jails/camps, and military criminals. His unit was essentially designated as a rearguard unit meant to hunt down enemy partisans, or in most cases civilians in occupied countries. Oscar de Loanger SS unit was responsible for many atrocities. Some atrocities so barbaric and bad other SS units reported him and his unit for atrocities. A few examples, which have been popularized in film, include taking an entire village in Belarus and putting them in a church, locking the doors, and setting the church ablaze. Anyone who tried to escape was shot by machine guns and rifles. This unit raped, tortured, and murdered its way through Eastern and Central Europe. During the Warsaw Uprising they were sent to help squelch the uprising. One of their atrocities committed was going into a children's hospital, telling the nurses and staff that they were there to secure the church. Okay, once the church was secured they raped the female staff and some of the wounded and sick female children victims, and then went around shooting everyone. If anyone was found to have survived they were bayoneted. These guys were so horrible that other Nazis looked down their noses at them, and constantly filed complaints and reports against them, but with no real success. Thankfully by the end of the war this unit was destroyed, and its leaders and criminal soldiers were hunted down like rabid animals. From an article, the Red Army pushed west and a Soviet soldier shot him in the chest. De Loanger survived and went into hiding. French authorities later captured him in Orchausen in southern Germany after the war. They tossed him into a camp to await trial, but he never made it. The French authorities at the time claimed de Loanger died of natural causes, but the man's cellmate said he watched as Polish guards beat him to death. If Polish guards did beat him to death, then it was an appropriate end to one of World War II's most savage war criminals. The French authorities at the time claimed de Loanger died of natural causes. Considering the atrocities he committed, being beaten to death should be considered natural cause of death for him. I worked for U-Haul when I was 18, and it was located in front of a club that was known for being really sketchy. I came in to open one morning, and it was common for people to knock on the door hoping to get in early and get their truck. On this day, I hear frantic knocking on the door. I'm there alone still, so it kind of startled me. I look and there's a woman, completely naked, covered in what looks like blood. I called the cops and grabbed one of the moving blankets and went outside to cover her up. She smelled really bad and was a mess. Ended up being blood and her own shit she was covered in. Found out later she was drugged at the club that night/early morning, raped and left, blacked out in the alley. It was just a fucked up and surreal situation to be involved in. What a nightmare. I'm glad you could help. You know you're in a bad situation when you're just looking to the nearest human being for help. Told this here before but once more. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there would be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noise, so he'd go outside to look around, but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property, but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he'd started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around and would find nothing. So they told him he needed to stop calling them for this, and perhaps get a security camera or whatever. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cig out and snuck around to the front and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, that is, without lights/sirens, and when they approached the van, the doors swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that people were shooting up in there. Yikes. What relief for that man to know he wasn't going crazy though. My wife arrived at her parents' house that she was currently living in due to health issues of her father's. She got into the house, no one else was there at the time, and instead of going further in, stopped in the first room that held the computers, which was right by the door. She went into the room and was messing around on the internet when one of the cats came into the room. Her cat, to be precise. Well, this cat was super laid back, loved everyone and never picked fights or got aggressive. He would literally lay down and let squirrels throw pecans at him from trees and do nothing but take it. Not tonight, however. Tonight he was growling and hissing intermittently while standing between my wife and the entrance to the rest of the house. A laid-back sweet old cat was acting like he was going to rip out a throat. Well, my wife decided that this was really fucking weird, so she picked up her cat and left the house. Lo and behold, she sees a cop car patrolling down her street and flagged them down. She explained the situation and they demanded that she stay in their cruiser while they both checked it out. Turns out they found the back door wide open. Super bad. Her parents and her never leave the door unlocked, much less open. She came to find out later from those cops that they were hunting down a serial rapist that had been spotted in the area, and that was why they were rolling down a safe, normally residential street. Super spooky. Life pro tip: always trust the cat. I used to have an incredibly chill, skittish little Siamese cat. Not a fighter, not a ruffian. She would hide under the bed when anyone but me was in the house. Landlords and repair workers would say, "I thought you said you had a cat." But she was extremely loyal to me and bonded to me. I was living in an attic apartment where the front door opened onto stairs, and then the stairs went straight up into the living room. One night she is standing at the foot of the stairs inside the house, yowling her full head off, just howling and yowling, and really going to town. I'm half asleep and listening to her and wondering WTF, wishing she would stop. Then I hear it. A hand grabs the doorknob and turns it. Click. Turns it again. Click. Turns it again. Click. Someone is quietly but forcefully trying to jimmy open the door by twisting the doorknob hard in the middle of the night. Boom, I'm awake. My feet are on the floor. I'm like immediately vertical, and my cat races to the top of the stairs, looks me in the eyes and falls silent. She had done her job and gotten my ass up. This is about 2 AM and my boyfriend at the time would sometimes come home super late from his overpass job. So the first thing I do is call him and whisper, asking him if he's trying to get in the front door. He says, "What? Fuck no. Call the cops now. Turn on all the lights in the house. Make noise. Get off the phone with me and call the cops. Then call me right back." I do that, and the doorknob stops. The cops come and search the area in the block and find no one. It never happened again. After that I also barricaded the door. I'll never forget that what could have been an extremely dangerous, if not potentially brutal situation in the middle of the night was foiled by my gentle little scaredy cat pussycat with big saucer eyes who was terrified of her shadow. But when shit got real, she woke my ass up. I couldn't have asked more of a dog. Cats are badass. Never doubt it. My girl has gone on across the rainbow bridge, as they say, but I'll always treasure her loyalty and intelligence in this. Yeah. The old boy in my story lived to be 0.23 years old. About that I think. He's up in the big cat box in the sky with all my other fluffy babies. A headless, limbless torso was found in the bushes at the rest stop in the town where I grew up. They never found the rest of her body parts or the murderer. She wasn't even identified until about a decade later. She was a prostitute that had been estranged from her family. My mom's theory is that a truck driver from out of state did it, dismembered her, dumped her torso at the rest stop, and scattered the rest of her over state lines. Could have been an isolated incident, or it could be a serial killer. We might not ever know. I was in a crappy motel. The room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes. This is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out, while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked, and not expecting him to break in. Motel on what RV? Sacramento. Fuck what avenue? I used to live near there. Ghetto. I work at a maximum security prison and we have several inmates who are severely mentally ill. The ones that self-harm wear a Fitbit kind of thing to monitor heart rate. If there is a change we rush their room to stop whatever is happening. On top of this we also do visual inspections. On one round a coworker was doing cell checks and noticed this particular inmate had blood on their face but nothing came up on the monitors or anything. So he called to the inmates to ask if they were okay. The inmate had their eyes closed and just kept repeating, "It doesn't hurt." The inmate would not answer where the blood was from. We opened the cell to see what the situation was, and it turns out the inmate had plucked out both of their eyes and they were laying on the floor. The inmate's hour monitor never alerted and the inmate never screamed. Paramedics said the inmate's vitals were normal and the inmate was fully responsive. Holy fuck, so he was calm throughout that shit. Yet no elevated heart rate, no sign that the inmate was in any discomfort at all. That there's a guy casing the bar that I work at literally right now, and I can't do anything to stop him. He's been in asking what time/days we are open, and what days we have security. Caught him feeling the corners of our windows and doors too. Unfortunately, until he breaks in and robs us, the police won't do a thing. I hope you took a picture of him. Yeah, we have a crystal clear close-up of his face. We took it, and told him we know he's watching us. He won't last 2 seconds if we did rob us, or any venue around us. But we are a small bar with single members of staff on at a time, so it's worrying. I would give him wrong information. Tell him there isn't security when there is. Makes it easier for you in the long run. I posted this before, but mine. When I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical social team. Out for beers and pizza, after with the guys. Family event type thing. My parents were good friends with 2 of the other couples. Both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other 2 couples had left their kids at one of their houses. With a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night. But I was being fussy and my mom nixed the idea, though they would 100% have normally gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. 2 men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive with them to bank/a grocery store, where one dad was manager, and clear out accounts/a safe. They then came back to the house, and slaughtered both families, the babysitter, and her boyfriend, kids included. They caught the 2 guys later on. My dad attended the trials, and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day, too. Got an article on this, but fuck. I spent my first 10 years in New Delhi. Back then, we would find dead women, burnt with acid or set on fire, and it used to be so normal. Like, oh look, another one of those dowry cases, where her family didn't pay the husband enough money, so they killed her. Many years later I revisited those memories, and realized how insane that actually was. I'd totally forgotten about all that. People who use acid as a weapon are seriously fucked. People who kill women over dowries are seriously fucked. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible, back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden, unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out, as he lost control, and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters, 35 feet, deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he plowed through. The car ended up the right way up, and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head, when it severed his spinal cord. That would be so fucking traumatic for the other driver. Old Janita from high school. Friendly Ecuadorian man who went piping. Worked at the school for 20 plus years and nobody had a problem with him. I guess his wife was leaving him, and in the process of moving out, he caught her in bed with her new man. Next day, in the middle of town, he opened fire on her, the man, and then killed himself before any cops had time to respond. My mom was driving and a guy ran out in the road, so she stopped, so she couldn't hit him. It was nighttime, so it was pretty dark out, and 3 other men emerged from the forest around, all trying to use the door handles of her car to get in. She locked them luckily, and gassed it to the nearest town. Remember to always lock your car after you start it, because if it wasn't unlocked who knows what would have happened to her. Probably one of the many reasons newer cars auto-lock their doors once you go over 15 miles per hour.